Lounge with the 2MK team. As always, we are playing Dead or Alive on this Thursday evening, and you are free to join us by searching for a Loser Stays On lobby. As you can, well, rather will soon see, this is Loser Stays with a limit of approximately C for the levels of the optimal, since we do still play this game only once a week and haven't necessarily learned how to stand up to people above that level yet. Might not be as useful for learning things, but you can definitely jump in and get some games. The loser stays is set to 3 consecutive losses, so your turn will come around one way or another. And even if you think you're not very good, you don't have to worry about sticking too heavily to the top. Once you've lost 3 times in a row, you'll still be pushed off for the next person to come in. This is basically an Atlantic Rim lobby. Anywhere along that line. You can also try from the Midwest. And we don't really have any restrictions on connection. It's fairly obvious when the lag makes something unplayable, and mostly people will leave after that when they recognize the situation. It does help, of course, if you are playing on a wired connection, but we won't even fuss too much about the, as you are known, Wi-Fi warriors, as long as you don't try to overdo everything. This is not high competition yet, after all. Today's topic will be specifically when to think in fighting games. Some people prefer to think a lot of the time. Some people have deep analytics going on at all moments. But it does help quite a lot if you've done most of that beforehand. Especially if you're not too familiar with the games in general. Even if you are familiar, sometimes it's easier to just ignore the most correct thing to do and go based on your instinct. There's a difference, therefore, between knowledge and thinking. This is something if you played basically any sport, and technically almost any game at a mid-level, you may already understand, even if you're not clear on a why. When you see something happen, the key is that you understand what happened. You understand probably why it happened, and if you needed it to not happen again, you at least understand what is required to prevent it. Now, in a fighting game, that definitely won't cause you to win or lose, because the game isn't so simple. It's lots of fun, but it's not as simplistic as we're now going to go do this thing, my opponent beat me using this technique, I know how to avoid that technique, therefore I will win. Fighting games generally don't work like that because there are so many options for most characters to use to get anywhere. Today we've been having some weird failed to start session or failed to reset session issues. You may have these issues as well when trying to deal with the online lobby system in any form. And we're not entirely sure where they came from or what they imply, so we'll hope that it doesn't terribly mess with anything. But we do tend to have problems on these streams and have issues with them sometimes needing to restart, sometimes needing to restart the entire system as well, the whole game, everything, and sometimes you just have to wait kind of long and the stream goes dead while it's all going on. Do bear it in mind though, because we may have to flicker in and out, and if it gets really bad, there's a good chance we'll call off this stream. Sometimes that does not mean that all of the lounges are closing, but Definitely the lounge host changes and some other things happen. So today let's talk about thinking. I'm going to do my usual and not think at all. But I will try to explain to you why every single thing that happens that seems to matter to the matchup happens. Very close range interactions, you can't necessarily say anything about. For example, my opponent is used to fighting me in many games and is used to the idea that my characters have deceptive attack ranges. But no matter how used you are to it, you're still going to have to at some point get caught by something, because otherwise my characters would be terrible. One of my skills, therefore, is making very quick decisions after I've realized that either a miss has happened or a situation hasn't gone as expected. My opponent is good at armoring through, feeling out what's going to happen, and so on. We have usually very good matchups for this reason because we both actually get to use all of our skills. Omni Rabbit will get through a ton of things that if I go too straightforwardly, I can't just attack, basically. If I try to just straight up attack on Kasumi and use her pressure-y style combos, I'm going to get punished, I'm going to get held, I'm going to get thrown. Basically, nothing is going to work. My opponent is just too aware of what I'm trying to do most of the time, and doesn't necessarily go all that hard on the offensive either. Has a good sense for when things are going to happen. In fact, the more I think about what should happen, the less likely I am to have any success whatsoever. For example, I thought, I should hold mid-kick there, but Omni did not go for mid-kick because why do that? So, I have to go beyond just making the correct movements and hoping that the read will work. It has to be, I'm going to make you think one thing is happening, and then something else has to happen. For both of us, it's usually pretty exciting and lots of fun. As long as I don't overdo it, because it's not as fun if I just keep on exploiting the same reaction over and over. One, my opponent should eventually train to prevent that one from happening, which actually lessens my effectiveness. So I wouldn't want to do it over and over. And it would make Omni Rabbit have to play in a much more defensive style, not taking the risk to hit buttons because he can never be sure whether or not the thing I did was a mistake, which is really good in tournaments. Not so good for helping your friends learn to fight your character. Omni Rabbit's skills are very strong when it comes to also not thinking. But, just like me, Omni collects a lot of data about things. Why does this happen? Can I do this? Can I do this in reaction to this? And isn't so easily discouraged either, which is really helpful. This is really important when you're first learning to play a game that you've learned in possibly some match previously, that you can punish this thing with that thing, or you can whiff punish this way, or that this move is evadable at this timing. And then you fight someone else and it doesn't work. And it's really hard to be sure, wait, was that me not doing it quickly enough? Was it lag? Was it the game being somehow changed? Because you could go a really long time without playing certain games, and tiny buffs, and like just recently Street Fighter V has had an update that makes Ryu's crouching medium kick 1 frame faster, and the number of things this changes in everyone's matchups is an essay and a whole stream unto themselves. If you didn't know about that, then you could find yourself being very confused. But the correct thing to do would not be to think about, well, what should I do differently? How can I do this differently? The correct thing to do, at least at first, is to keep doing the same thing and gather more data. Aim to get more understanding. What if the thing you were thinking about as a problem is just lag, or you just not hitting the button fast enough today, or your opponent standing at a range that you could learn or even could manipulate so that they tend to mix up and mess up in the end anyway. So even against a player like me, you still have the option to, oh, well, I shouldn't stand here. If I don't stand there, it means that move isn't confusing anymore and the thing I already knew about it still counts. Great. Now, Ami can get a little bit upset about specific parts of this, but it's not usually about whether or not things don't work a specific way. It's usually actually the opposite. Knowing that something works a specific way, understanding that the opponent has figured out a way to make it go differently, but then realizing, oh no, I've trained to like hit this move with this move every time. I'm gonna have to spend like 3 rounds now just trying to get myself to not do that so that they can't beat me up. It's not the greatest of feelings, but it's still technically based on understanding and not spending a whole lot of time thinking. The alternative would be much worse, to assume that you didn't understand anything about the move from before, change your entire playstyle, probably still lose for other reasons, and learn nothing. Being able to play instinctively is part of what makes fighting games fun for a lot of people. Not everyone. But the types of games we play tend to lend themselves to it a lot better than most. Being able to partially feel out your opponent's goals, really understand ranges based on something else you've done, and just take it calmly when your opponent manages to get around you or confuse you in some way without necessarily going, oh, this is terrible. Because thinking about it too much just makes your mental slots for all the stuff you need to do in the matchup fill up, and it puts you into a different mental state, period. Literally, thinking about how to win a match in specific ways, thinking about something other than what you understand of the matchup already, makes you not only predictable, but often slightly slower. While many people are frustrated by the fact that these games do in fact rely on some levels of reaction, that a lot of what you're doing are execution or reaction tests. Can you block this in time? Can you hold this in time? Can you move in this countering way to whatever they're doing within the time frame you have? They'd be very boring without any of this, because you'd have no options for overwhelming an opponent who simply practiced constantly.
I, on the other hand, can be thought of as thinking too much a lot of the time. I have a grand tendency to focus heavily, try and figure out how to trick or control my opponent in some way or another, think about things in advance, decide what I'm going to do, etc. And it works out for me sometimes, but no, overall, it does have those same effects that Rillian just noted. I end up unable to react to certain things, mainly because I'm priming myself to react to different sets of things and then just go right through if my opponent doesn't do what I expect. It works very well if I understand exactly what's going on and what my opponent's going to do, but then if you fight a stronger opponent or your opponent figures you out or I become too predictable, you hit my usual failure case, and well, let's just say there's a reason I really need to train on that whole aspect of these games. I'm sure you'll get a bit of a preview momentarily. as soon as this match finishes loading. I feel like it's honestly one of the reasons that I have trouble with Omni-Rabbit specifically.
Even for you, Helena.
But it's definitely something that will come up here too.
I cannot lose this fight.
At the risk of sounding corny, therefore, one of the things in fighting games that defeats you most easily is the concept of can't. Not because you should just decide, well, I will do whatever I feel like and screw my opponent's options, whatever. It's more so in the sense of thinking about what you can and can't do in a specific way that matters. You slow down every time you think of an option. You want to do it. You want to do the jump kick here. You want to do this side step. You want to do this hold. And you have some small amount of time to think about this plan or intent and go, that can't work. Or that won't work. It's the same feeling though. The concept of that can't work is probably the most crippling in terms of just your speed. Because the amount of brain power required for a human to go, wait, no, that can't be right, for pretty much anything, is actually really large. It takes much more focus, let's say, to decide this can't happen, because then you have to rethink all of your data to figure out what can work. And your brain will start to do this most of the time without you telling it to. Without your instinctive playstyle actually getting involved at all. Some people are fairly lucky and can go, well, that can't work, time to do whatever I normally do. But this is also limiting against an opponent who understands you too well, because they will know what your default is and they will stop it. So it's actually making your fighting worse on two levels. It makes you slower, and it can make you predictable. Especially when it loops. When you think, I can't do that when it won't work. And immediately go, oh, I should do, wait, no, I can't do that anymore either because my opponent just did. And by that time they've kicked you, and you have no more options. This can even go further than that. You'll end up taking the damage, thinking about, okay, let me think about that situation I was just in again, try to figure out what to do when I get back there, and your opponent like hits you again and you don't actually get anywhere because you've already gotten too deep into the rabbit hole of your own mind.
Sounds like what happens to me all the time.
One of the core things to learn to train, therefore, from that side fairly early on is to completely let go. When you realize you've gotten at least as far as, I don't know what to do here. I can't think of anything to do. I can't do the next move. I can't see what my opponent is doing. Most of us can't stop ourselves from trying to figure something out. But most of the time you can't do that mid-match. It often has a lot of prerequisite knowledge in it, and any misconception whatsoever is going to slow you down a lot. If you therefore decide, I'm going to take on this problem by stopping, by not thinking, the main thing you'll need from there is the ability to not only not think, but to let go to the point where your muscle memory does at least part of the job for you. But your muscle memory has to go beyond just what I mentioned before, just doing the thing that you most naturally do. The easiest thing you can do in most games to help yourself out is spend that time on movement. hopefully you won't have built up any really strong movement habits. It can happen to people in games, especially 2D ones, but 3D games,
Don't have time to play games.
you might have a little more flexibility in terms of your movement habits. So when I start a match like this, I'm not really thinking about what to do next. I'm thinking about the fact that, oh, I don't know what to do, so I should move around a little bit. This can lead to something I've mentioned before on streams, a tendency to let my guard down in spaces where I have nothing I can do. I just kind of stand there and hope that nothing bad will happen. One good thing is that I'm fairly intimidating as a player, I find. Most people avoid attacking me because I tend to play characters that can easily deal with whatever they do. And I've sometimes, by the time I've gotten to that point, managed to demonstrate to them, I'll actually stop you from doing a bunch of stuff, you probably shouldn't just randomly attack me. If I haven't managed to establish that, then I tend to be in a lot of trouble in these situations because my opponent won't know what to do, but they will know that I can't do much either. So, doing their randomness is kind of helpful. But if I'm facing an opponent who doesn't actually know this, or who doesn't have particularly unpredictable attack strings, or ideas of how to fight, then it's often effective. This is something you'll see really often between Kansuke Dynasty and I, actually. She has trouble telling what exactly it is I'm thinking about. But her main options for doing things don't tend to work that well, just as a character thing. And because I don't think about the fact that I take damage when they happen, I don't really care so much either. Like, that kick was a tenth of my health, but I don't actually think about whether or not that was important. This is helpful in long-term play because if you don't care about your opponent's better options enough, or rather the options they tend to hit often that actually hit, they're not always good options because they might not always do enough damage. Eventually this moment happens, where you have some new tool offered by your meter, the range, something in the stage, your opponent lacking meter, it's usually your own meter though. And you realize, oh, I have a tool against this. And the fact that I have this tool means that I can just use it in hopes that they do the same thing that's been hitting me all this time. That's why things like what feels like people just randomly doing raw super are both frustrating and cognitively loading. Like, you'll think too much about the fact that that happened to you. But you shouldn't really think about it that much. The reason she got hit with the super is because she had managed to hit me with kicks so much before. If I had somehow taken less of those kicks, discouraged her from hitting that, she might have been more subdued and neutral, less likely to do the kick, and then that entire interaction wouldn't happen. We'd have to play out the rest of the match probably in complex footsies. This is why in many games, beating people with perfects without just overwhelming them in a couple of interactions is actually much harder, because it means you have to be able to know, react to, or foresee every single thing they were going to do. Even if your own character's offense is particularly good or their damage is high, except for games like one-hit kill games, some extent Dragon Ball Fighters, but not really, and Guilty Gear Strive if you're playing Potemkin.
I don't have time to play games with you.
Also Saul. Also Rambo. Never mind. Just Guilty Gear Strive as a generality. As long as you're not playing like... Who even can't do that? There's at least some meter requirements though, so... Let's stick to saying just Saul and Potemkin. Even Saul can't do it that easily. It's fine to prime yourself for a thing your opponent can do, but not to think too hard about what will happen. In fact, one of the best things you can do for yourself is think, my opponent is about to go for this kick. I might get hit, or I might hold it, depending on my reactions. And it's very important to think in specifically that way when you're learning. I might get hit, and I might hold it. Because if you think I might get hit, then you can think about what happens after you get hit. It also takes off a lot of mental pressure on you, because people often stress themselves out thinking, I can't get hit, I mustn't get hit. This is bad. If it happens, it means that the situation is terrible. It doesn't mean any of that. That's where comebacks come from. Comebacks come from getting into your groove, realizing your opponent hasn't necessarily done all that much other than beat your reactions, and then if your reactions get better enough, then you might just win anyway. It of course depends on your opponent's mindset toward a lot of things, but it's definitely there. This is worse when you find yourself thinking, oh, they're going to keep doing that move. Because not only would they not necessarily keep doing that move,
What happened to all that spirit you had?
if you couldn't stop it the first couple of times, waiting to try to check your reactions to make sure you do it the next time is just adding more and more stress every time you fail. Your opponent might not even be trying to grief you, but you'd still end up feeling as if that's what was happening. Even worse, when they do choose to do something different, you weren't prepared for it because your mind was so deeply in the mode of, I need to hold this kick that I think they're going to do eventually. You kind of just stand there and freeze up. Now, this isn't to say that solving your problems with offense is the correct thing all the time, but you definitely should consider it at least some of the time. Unless your opponent's moves tend to check your approaches quite a lot, sometimes you should just hit buttons. See what you can come up with, see if you can get out of the way, or in this game use, for example, your sidestep attack to get you a little further in. Just change the situation somehow, rather than standing there and waiting for their flying kick or whatever to prove to yourself or them or both that you can actually stop them from doing it. Because the truth is, if you could easily do that, you would probably have managed it, and there are days when you just can't do it. Learning to work around those moments where, oh, I've done this many times before, why is this not working today? I've missed every single one, this is terrible. Being able to go, well, I guess I'll do something else and avoid that situation. The match might not be as favored for me if I can't hold this attack, or can't block this mix-up, or can't position myself for this specific thing, but I should probably just hit some buttons and see if I can get myself less stressed out. The match will not only probably be more interesting, you're much more likely to, in most games, build up a meter that will solve your problem for you. That is why many of the games got meters at all. It's a way to utilize the fact that you've gotten beat up so much, or in some games, not that, specifically the fact that you landed a couple of hits, to deal with one situation you can't deal with. And that's really nice to have in games. The feeling of, well, I always get hit by this kick, but if I get enough meter before the 5th time they do it, I can stop this from happening at least once. And then I can keep on fighting my way. another perfect example of the same situation. This can also make the game meaningfully more fun for players who aren't necessarily as good at scheming or doing things with spacing, or who play characters whose offense is their primary tool. It can end up feeling kind of bad sometimes to realize that the quote-unquote only reason you're beating someone is because you keep using the same move. Especially when that move is a natural part of your arsenal that can be used effectively, but you're not sure whether or not you're being effective or not. If you can look at a move and go, I think my spacing was off there, but your opponent basically didn't counter it and they might be a little salty because of getting hit by it too many times, it can end up not being fun for you either.
I'm giving this all I got.
Down the hatch.
Bradbon can be this sort of character, but it happens for a specific reason that most players can get around, which is both frustrating and confusing for the person playing Brad. The entire strength of the Drunken Master style is that you can't tell what Brad is going to do beforehand. Something we're probably going to end up talking about tomorrow on Street Fighter for a different reason. The main way to deal with this is exactly what you see OmniRabbit doing now. Sometimes you just attack Brad from so far away that it doesn't matter. And because most of Brad's unconventional tricky stuff only works if you don't play defensively long enough for them to actually see anything, it tends to be a little more likely that he'll actually take the damage. There are lots of characters in games like this where they are able to enter more unpredictable states by entering a stance with weaker defense. Since we have mic issues that have to be resolved, hopefully shortly. Alright, that probably resolved it.
Go away.
Well, these things do happen. Honestly, that's not the worst of the technical issues we've tended to have sometimes on this stream.
For footsie characters and technical characters, players often do end up doing something you might think of as thinking. And I guess you can use that word for it, but a better way to think about what it is they're doing is more so measuring. That's generally the style of our Ayane. Which is also why when one gets really close, things shift a little bit, and offense becomes stronger. Because a lot of the benefits of Ayane come from moving around, similar to Kasumi being somewhat unpredictable, but with much bigger sweeping attacks and ways of getting through the opponent's various options. However, using that spacing, that constant shifting, isn't necessarily a matter of thinking about what will happen next. In fact, the next highest level of it you could get is to just move. And at the end of your movement, recognize what has shifted, recognize what your options that remain are, and just picking one. You can try picking it based on something your opponent has done, or something you've seen them do often enough that you know, it's statistically likely that you'll win out. But even this is not in itself enough. Ah, that one bar is finally sort of meaning something today. Normally it doesn't. But then again, it's usually not literally one. This is why it's actually been so important for them to work on holds, because close range defense allows for resetting of this situation where measuring isn't really doing anything anymore. Attacks are just coming, and the game does offer something for that, specifically meter usage in form of break hold. But if the opponent gets close too early, or when you have too little meter to actually use the break hold, it can take a while to get out of these situations. It looks like we're not going to see too much issues from the net connection. Possibly some time for them to be resolved. Or to just resolve themselves, because the internet does that sometimes. Now we have the opposite side from OmniRabbit, to the point where this is less fun if I play Kasumi than if I play Nico, but I'm going to play Kasumi anyway. Kasumi suffers in a similar way to Ayane in matchups like this one. The opponent can find ways to get close, possibly ways to... An opponent that doesn't necessarily care about when Kasumi's blocking is a bit more dangerous. What I mean by that is simple enough. If your character benefits from being really close and continuing to hit attacks, every time Kasumi misses but I still have enough time to block is an opportunity to do that, to attack and force the situation where I probably didn't have the chance to hold or didn't really think I should risk it, and so on. I hit random and I still end up here. How wonderful. Now, this isn't so terrible if you just keep on attacking from the Kasumi side. But as soon as I get into this situation, I have to start doing a lot more something akin to thinking, which I don't like doing. Now, I do know how to get around a ton of stuff that Kokoro wants to do. The key is mostly not sticking too close after you've actually managed to do something. Making the opponent want to get close to you for a moment or so, and then dealing with that. The reason is because the closer you get, the more you try to push your own close range advantage, the more likely it is that you're going to get blocked or mess it up and be too close to take advantage of all the other crazy things you can do. Here, for example, I can pretty much get out of situations by being slightly too far away for them to be dangerous. But this, for example, is a bad situation. My opponent is continuing to be close, and I have to actually consider how do I get out of this in the time I have available to me. That's partially why I didn't finish that combo. I would have ended up closer again. So I'm going to spend the meter to get the life lead and a lot of distance. What you don't want Kokoro to have for any matchup is the ability to keep hitting you without knocking you away from her. You at least want that when you get hit by Kokoro, that she hasn't stuck to you. And you see there, I kept on hitting things, keeping me too close, and the situation turned poor. Fortunately, as I've mentioned before, she's a relatively easy character to throw because she has that precise problem. All of her really good attacks, all of her really good combos and stuff require dedication. You have to think about the fact that you intend to do specifically this or you're going to get the knockaway moves and lose your advantage. But there you go again. I moved too close, and my opponent was able to, from block, make the decision, this is my advantageous move. Sometimes you have to give up your pressure and go back to neutral simply because that's where you had it better. That's where you didn't have to worry about your opponent getting to, for free, hit one of their better startup attacks. One of the things that gives them advantage over time, even if you block it. You really should try to avoid being in that situation, even if you have to give up some potential damage to do it. Especially if your own offense isn't all that good yet, because at that point you are pushing against your opponent's defensive skill with offense that won't necessarily overcome it, and giving them free counterattacks. A lot of the time, in many games, once you are that close, not even the best players can react to every variation, to every concept that the opponent could have. In 2D games, this is often in the form of a tick throw, or some sort of special metered cancel. In these games, it's often the close range attacks that have quick strings. You can't afford to just whiff, hold, and hope for the best. And if you do this, you often end up taking not only a full combo, but one that puts you back where you started. This is something you can definitely use from the opposite side when you've realized, oh, I get to stay close and my character gets to use attacks that aren't so complicated. I don't have to time them all that wonderfully. They have multiple hits or something. They're not terribly predictable even when someone sees them with. Those sorts of attacks are very helpful to get you through games like this with offensive characters. But high offense characters generally don't do so well in other situations, so they have that for that reason. Kokoro is interestingly not super great at offense unless you let her be. We've discussed on multiple streams before that all Elena really has to do to control this matchup is go into her down stance. And while it won't protect her from everything Kokoro does, it will protect her from most of the things that matter or do a lot of damage. Certainly from almost all of the things that set up a worse situation. From the opponent's side, this is bad because it makes them think. You have to spend time figuring out, right, how do I beat this again? What are my options? One of them's predictable, one of them's not damaging. It's best to never get into that situation at all mentally. Just go for stuff. And hopefully, over time, you'll build up a repertoire of semi-random things to do that aren't so predictable that your opponent just does whatever they feel like. Fortunately for Kokoro, she is a character who can confirm really well. If she does manage to land a hit, she doesn't have to spend as much time thinking about, can I continue this combo? So, our Kokoro player can improve just by practicing combo timings and hit confirms, another thing you're probably going to hear a lot about tomorrow.
Alrighty. Along the lines of the whole, what you're thinking about during a match thing, one of the problems that I tend to have, or sort of get myself stuck in a sort of repeating over time loop of uncertainty over, is what exactly am I supposed to focus on during a match? Like, what... I can think about nothing at all, and that will get me to a certain point. I can try to plot my opponent's downfall in certain ways, and that will get me to a point. But figuring out what I should use as, like, my baseline level of... or my baseline... not necessarily level of thinking about during a match, but what to focus on or where to start from. I tend to be a little wishy-washy about overall. Obviously, understanding what is going on is basically the foundation. Without that, you're in a random environment doing random things and having random outcomes. So figuring out what your opponent is doing that is working or not working is obviously helpful. And if you don't know what your options are against it, there's always the testing for that. But I don't necessarily know where to go beyond there when But when it's more so a matter of predicting what my opponent will do, or well, sometimes how to approach, depending on who I'm fighting. My characters help me out a bit with this, because I do tend to play people who have relatively good control of spaces and the ability to hit people for doing certain things. But the level beyond that is tricky, in part because I tend to get myself caught up in, well, whatever the thing of the day is, really.
Promise me you won't tell anyone.
And it can sometimes be difficult to bring myself back to that sort of neutral space and start the process again of figuring out what the next step is, more or less.
One helpful factor in all of that, at least for Consequence, given the words she uses, are that the answers are contained within those words. When you have nothing else to do, when you can't figure out what else to happen, and you want to find a way to let go of all your thoughts, then you do as mentioned before. Spend all of your focus on just measuring the space between yourself and your opponent. Because if you do this, it will often give you ideas, especially if you've played the game for any reasonable amount of time. If you know your character's options fairly well, which many of us do by the time we played this long, then your thought is, oh right, this move reaches this far. This is a type of training you can use in 2D games as well, because you can use it to determine which anti-air is necessary at a specific spacing point. You know, as long as your opponent doesn't constantly move things around by whipping moves or similar. But even then, that can be learned over time. So what you're aiming to do often here is just measure the distance, and that will put you back into a literally neutral space. It's because the opponents can sometimes get into positions where they keep on pressuring you, but in that situation you've already got something to think about. They're hitting you, whether you're blocking or not. In this case, we're about to see a match where this sort of works, but not entirely, for both sides. Hitomi benefits from measuring the space to Brad Wong only on defense. She can't really use it for offense because there's no clear-cut way to hit Brad Wong other than just, okay, I'm gonna just do a big sweeping move and go all out here. That's more a matter of guts and timing. Similarly, while Brad Wong could measure the distance, the entire way one beats Brad Wong is to ignore the distance. You just hit as hard as possible from as far as possible. There's no specific reason to spend too much time thinking in Brad's sense, okay, how should I do this part of footsies? You're aiming to block your opponent's approaches or to get out of the way, but you should never spend too much time thinking about, well, my opponent is here, therefore this is probably the thing on their mind. Or, my opponent has gotten close, therefore they're probably going to try this. A lot of the time, if someone is close to Brad Wong, they're not even thinking about offense, because it might get messed up by any number of weird things that Brad decides to do. One tip is to press your 3P and just hope for the best, honestly. Depends on the character, but it's probably better than most of the other things you're doing. Because like Kokoro, Brad's moves are delayed in such a way that even if you thought you knew exactly what was going to happen and you went for the hold would be too early a lot of the time, which is super frustrating and probably is a large part of the reason why just hitting down forward punch is effective. Realizing, you know what, your move is going to take long enough to start anyway, that all I need here is the maximum amount of dodging. Maximum amount of dodging or chance to trade. If your 3P is therefore a relatively quick move, go for that. If it's not and you need to use 2 or 1P, more or less the same thing. But here we see the opposite happening. Our Hitomi player is attempting to defend, and sometimes I'm fairly sure, given these holes, they're probably somewhat correct. It's not terribly difficult because of at least our Brad player's tendencies to go, well, you know what? You're probably doing kicks now because punches aren't the win condition here. So, yeah, I'm either holding mid-kick forward or low, probably. Because you could just duck under all the highs anyway, right? And so far I haven't seen a situation mostly where the problem is directly related to, okay, there's a low happening here, but I was holding mid. It does happen, but it hasn't happened a ton yet.
How was my fighting? Want to do it again?
So, you just hit 3P or whatever your crouching P is the fastest one, and that should partially resolve your problem. The bigger issue is that these moves don't normally combo well, they don't knock the opponent away, and you're not much better off than where you started. One thing that is useful though, and something that doesn't come up a lot but does need to be considered, if you've hit your opponent and then they go for an attack right then, it's easier to learn how long after I landed my hit do I need to hold, than to just kind of sit there, both of you, in neutral, even at very, very close range. I guess it's not really neutral, but neither of you has hit any attacks, neither of you is blocking, and you kind of have to go, okay, I know Brad's about to do this, I should hold now, and ending up holding too early. Or, of course, too late, but that's not usually the problem. If you're playing a parry character in other games, or playing a game with a universal parry or hold like this one, this can be really important to understand. Learn what move causes enough hit stun on your opponent that your follow-up hold is a good thing. And it's particularly good for it to be a move that doesn't combo well, because your opponent's thought is usually, I should try to get out of this before you start hitting something that does. And this will often help them out. It will in fact work a lot of the time. Because all you care about as the player dealing with the situation is that you don't have to think so much. You're trying to reduce the amount of thinking you have to do. And that is most easily done, in this matchup at least, by hitting a crouching P and hoping for the best. Depending on your character, crouching K will also work, but those tend to be too standing and won't resolve your problem. You see this actually demonstrated even more strongly when Transiki Dynasty is doing it, because Helena has a move that allows her to swing upward from a crouching position. Ayane has one too that works relatively well in this matchup, but can be in the wrong spacing, let's say. Helena's is much more effective. Just an upward twirl, likely to evade a lot of specific attacks. It advances, so at the beginning of it isn't necessarily vulnerable to low strike kicks, and then it results in an upward poke that will probably catch anything Brad was wanting to do. This type of sweeping upward mid-attack also helps deal with all of those specific I'm crouching under you approach movements that Brad himself has. And they can often be done without having to step forward at all. If you've got a particularly good upward swing style ranged punch attack, it can help you out a lot in this matchup. It probably won't be as useful when you are already close together, and you should still look for the not terribly strong slight punch poke. But it can help characters who don't have a lot of options get through the neutral. You can already see it there. Ayane has a particularly good option here because Ayane's, the punch you just saw, the sweeping at the legs, does have something that goes well into it. Or rather, right after it. And deals with Brad not terribly well compared to some other characters, honestly, but it's definitely not terrible. Another thing these sorts of moves do, even if they don't do a lot of damage, is that they do usually enough pushback to create a different situation for you than the one you were worried about before. Demonstrated there in multiple ways by Sunter's attention. Backing off after the opponent has blocked a couple of them is helpful, sometimes throwing the opponent. Just generally being ready for their options really helps.
I don't need a drink to win.
Brad has moves that do defeat this, and they're very useful, but they do change things so that the offense you had to worry about when you weren't using this attack has to be dampened down. You don't have to spend as much time thinking about how precisely to block any given thing, because your opponent has to use options that are much easier to block, technically easier to hold, and an entirely different setup. This time, I'm actually going to play Nico. While the Kaisumi Ayane matchup is relatively fun, it's also one that we technically have practiced a lot. See if it'll give me the Aria Coliseum again. And honestly, this matchup is useful for explaining what I was talking about a bit better. Since Ayane and Kasumi have enough reach to relatively consistently punish the other for even the most egregious of trickery, it's exactly what you'd expect with two related ninjas fighting each other.
All right then.
Siblings at that.
Let us begin the experiment.
Nico has to react to a lot of things,
Chance to run away.
and utilize some extremely specific ranges to get anywhere. A lot of this, therefore, is more or less the same thing, but with a character who isn't trying to get to the same spots at all. Ayane therefore gets to use a lot more actual movement without thinking about the specifics of it. Standing so close, for example, is a big problem for exactly this reason. Nico is actually sort of... It might just be that I play Helene in a specific way, but it's much easier to play Nico with a stronger focus on her throws in a lot of situations. for me. They're relatively advantageous in a lot of situations, and she has enough complicated moves that your opponent can't be absolutely sure what's happening at any given time. So whether or not it's a good idea to grab is less clear to them and you. Therefore, like most games where you are dealing with a grappler style character, you should counter them by grappling yourself. Since her holds are also strong, relatively speaking, the expectation that you have to deal with it that way is important.
This only verified my hypothesis.
Another case where moving faster helps a little bit more than thinking through what you're doing. It's not entirely about the unpredictability of the character either. Although the ability to slow down some of her combos does help. That said, part of that was also for the purpose of increasing Ayane's familiarity versus Nico, in terms of, I should punish this at this time. Which is again, more or less just data collection. This match tends to be less so. But we've already discussed partially what needs to happen here. And honestly, I don't think it's terribly fun for either side. But there will be a lot of measuring from Ayane's side. And probably a lot of defending from Kokoro's side for the same reason that she defends in specific situations against Kasumi, waiting for the correct block to put her in a situation where she
So nice to meet you.
can hit things that are pressury. And getting damage off throws whenever she can't actually think of something to go there. This results in Ayane being able to use a lot of moves that follow on from her own failed attacks. From break hold to side steps to spins, anything that will get her out of the way of the most obvious counter-attack from Kokoro's side is helpful. It's not terribly difficult, therefore, to actually have some offense here if you think you can get your opponent to guess wrong. But since almost all those things are defeated simply by Kokoro hitting throw, Kokoro's side is, as mentioned, taking the damage from throw when she can and going for the strikes to get advantage when the player feels it's, oh, it's my turn, this might be a good idea. I feel like I'm going to get away with this time. Or, if for whatever reason the opponent has actually misspaced or mistimed one of their attacks even a little bit, and you realize, oh, I definitely have advantage now, I get to hit stuff. But again, note that the stuff we're talking about isn't a punish. It is, I'm going to hit advantageous attacks, one way or the other, to get to where I need to be to eventually open up this opponent. Or, if things aren't going so well, just go for the throw again. The slight delay on Kokoro's moves makes her somewhat difficult to hold, and she can relatively easily escape certain throws. Ayanes in particular are only strong at a specific timing and spacing. But there's that lag again today. Uncommon, but here we are. Honestly, advancing defensively without a necessary intent to hit a button, probably just to block, is really useful for Kokoro in this type of matchup. And thankfully, in this game, since normals are the majority of anything that's happening, or strikes of that type, have relatively long startups, your expectation can generally be that you'll be able to block in time, unless the situation is really bad. What you hope is that your opponent does not manage to find the exact correct button to hit to give themselves advantage because of how far you've advanced yourself. Now we're back around to partially where we started this stream. And as Katsuki Dynasty mentioned, part of the issue she has when fighting on Rabbit is that trying to do these things has mixed results, let's say.
Definitely. Rabbit is absolutely my worst opponent for, well, basically all the things I've discussed so far. Or we've talked about on the stream overall. He's the right type of defensive, the right type of patient, and has the right type of good sense in reads. Not to mention we fought each other a lot.
Unwrap has also been playing fighting games for long enough and at a high enough level such that, combined with personality, he doesn't really have the issue that I will patent calling battle tendency on third option. I should patent this, but no one's ever going to want to use it anyway. It is the shorter term for something really simple, but that doesn't necessarily enter people's heads a lot. Many of us know it automatically, but new players kind of don't realize that it's happening sometimes. If you do something once, and it works, and you do it again, and it works, and you have the opportunity to do it a third time, do you do it? Conservative or cautious people normally assume my opponent will counter this move, or will get out of the way of it, or something, and it is not worth doing it the third time. I should do something else to beat them expecting the counter. And there's a different type of player that will go, well, you couldn't stop it either of those times. I'm going to go for it again and see what happens, since it's not really causing me any damage or pain at this time. The sort of person that you have to convince not to do it.
Hello.
And over time, players can reach the point where they either understand which of those two things they are and can devote at least a little mental space to breaking the expectation of any opponent who knows them, or get even further than that and surpass having that tendency. Where instead of going, alright, first time worked, second time worked, third time is definitely or almost definitely this, where this could be in either direction as mentioned, they do manage to calm themselves enough to just pick randomly. And this is actually really hard, because you're already thinking about all the things your opponent could do. There are factors such as, are you winning the match? Would you manage to win if you landed it one more time? Does your opponent have a lot of meter? Should you be careful because they have a lot of meter? And so on. These things come up a lot in 2D games, more so because they tend to have different pressure on wake up. And on wake up, you definitely do things like, I used this Oki style meaty attack once, it worked. I used it again, it worked. And you have to decide, is my opponent going to use that meter to stop me from doing it the third time? Or are they going to expect me to bait them? That's a lot of meter though, it'll be a lot of damage if I don't bait them. You don't really know, even fighting specific people at higher levels, you won't be able to tell necessarily will they do this or not. Sometimes the character forces the issue a little bit more, but even that is still a matter of the same thing. You're exposing your opponent to the same situation. The third occurrence of a specific thing, what side does this opponent choose? So to get yourself to the point where you don't actually specifically have an expectation, where you just are able to let go and either choose randomly or be so clear about your situation. Let's say you have a ton of meter, or you have so much health that you don't even care if they wake up with their special attack or their invincible attack. You probably could win in neutral anyway, maybe that's what you want to happen. Any number of those things. Rather than simply responding to, oh, this probably should happen here, because that's what I believe, that's how I perceive life. This is particularly frustrating from the opposite side though. If you are a 2D game fan at all, then you probably know the term no one expects the third uppercut. Especially at beyond low levels. Sometimes not even too far beyond them. Where you did uppercut once and got away with it, did uppercut again and got baited. Do you do the third uppercut? And at the levels we're talking about, there's a very high tendency for the opponent to go, well, You did it once, you got away with it, you did it the second time, and I definitely stopped you. I definitely hurt you for doing it. You should learn your lesson and not do it the third time. Now, whether or not this is actually correct is not the point here. The point is that very few people expect the third uppercut beyond a certain level of play. If they believe you have other options, that you know something else you could do, most people are going to expect you to do that instead, especially if they did a really big damage on the last one, or if you could lose based on how they punished the next one they did. And of course, you as the player can decide, I could probably win this if I didn't do the uppercut. I have options that might get me past this. Let me try to use one of those. But sometimes you don't have quite that surety. Your opponent has a lot of meter themselves. They've got particularly terrifying pressure or offense. In a 2D game, you're in the corner, so you don't have anywhere to go. You shouldn't just decide, oh well, I'm going to do my basic defense stuff because I would lose if I did the uppercut and was wrong. Because there's a recent chance you were going to lose either way, and imagine how effective it is if your opponent is thinking the same thing you are, that you're not going to uppercut because you might die. And they've got all their setups for their most, as they say, grimy mix-up to make sure that you choosing to block will cause you to lose. 3D games don't have so much of this. There are less invincible moves as a generality. And most of the time, combos oddly don't do as much damage as good flows and reads in neutral, or they do comparable damage quite a lot of the time. Certainly, a lot of pressure stuff for most characters in these games isn't too overwhelming. There's some stuff usually with throws and getting people to not tech the throws properly, which is a lot of the way that grapplers do their job. You see Hitomi here using the kick instead of the punch. She is one of those characters that actually has this option. Many of them do, but Hitomi's is particularly effective because she does also crouch when she's using this move to some extent. It doesn't require that you outrange Brad either. And, as with all these cases, it's really not about just doing that move, but it can be very effective to just do it for a while. It never works as well for Space Wolf when doing this because of an expectation with how the game is played relative to us. Specifically, that the options being used aren't as strong on Brad as they are on Hitomi in the first place, and the player tends to have less overall awareness of why it's working. I will tend to more so repeat something until it stops working, which isn't the same thing as what Hitomi is trying to do here. In short, Brad is being hit low to prevent Brad from doing a certain set of things. And preventing Brad from doing those things is the useful win condition. Whereas, forcing Hitomi to block low doesn't do much of anything. She's comfortable enough there, she has lots of moves that could go over lows really easily, and she's usually advantaged in some other way anyway once you try to do it.
Wanna do it again?
Brad's lows are also generally more telegraphed, and the ones that aren't are the ones that involve Brad continuing to stand up, therefore possibly being beat out by a relatively long punch or kick before it actually hits. This is something you would also see if I played Kasumi again. The Kasumi versus Brad match tends to devolve into long-range shenanigans pretty fast, so I'm not doing that today. This should be much harder, because Nico doesn't have as much advantage on Brad here. There's no easy ways to be sure what to hold, and there's no terribly easy ways to get into range. Her long strikes, while effective, are standing, they aren't flying, they don't go through anything much. The one or two that do tend to trade, I think. So the situation isn't as advantaged for her. She more so relies on her ability to strike a certain relatively large space in front of her without thinking too hard about where exactly in that space she needs to hit. In other words, the same thing I mentioned before for Helena. An ability to do a large sweeping upward move that will somewhat evade and otherwise knock Brad out of a lot of things. Problem is, I don't remember how to do any of those moves. So, let's see what happens today. Practiced Colleen too much yesterday. And I still don't hold that kick well enough. But we get back to the same point. The opponent doesn't get to really learn whether or not something works if the only reason it's mattering is if you can't hold it. This can lead to frustration on both sides because one player is doing something that you know shouldn't work, and they probably know shouldn't work, and the other player is just unable to do anything about it enough to get advantage. I'm sure you all have seen matches where basically that just happens over and over. Brad does that move, and Brad gets defeated for doing it. Now I did hold back on the 2P because again I was supposed to use the other move, but I don't remember how to do them, so here we are.
My hypothesis.
The next match should be a lot more interesting in both senses. Kokoro doesn't give Brad as many opportunities to do the same things, and unlike many characters where you kind of want to hold the move to get into a situation where you can hit things that are advantageous to you, Kokoro basically manages to get away with just blocking, and then using her good chains off her various punches to get advantage based on Brad being so close. She does have a couple of abilities to hit from relatively far as well, to deal with the possibility of Brad trying to stay out of that situation. So, Kokoro mostly just has to do exactly what she does against Hitomi. Walk forward and kind of defend. This works on Ayane, Hitomi, and in many cases Brad, but the main thing about the Brad one is eventually Brad has options that don't involve using the same strings that she can easily take control after. But you can already see it. Basically, just blocking one's way through a lot of Brad's options is helpful enough. The main problem is understanding how to continue the offense on a character that isn't necessarily close enough to throw most of the time in those situations. Similarly, because other characters will try more things, they're not as likely to be as ready for the throw as a Brad player would be. You do see it playing out there though. Kokoro can reach a retreating opponent and continue her combos better than a lot of the other characters you see on this stream. Meaning that just blocking her way through Brad's offense and then doing just about anything really helps. The big question is, when does Brad's offense end? But she doesn't necessarily care as much about that either. If she has enough meter, she'll just decide eventually, okay, I guess that wasn't the time, let me break hold or standard hold out of this, and the problem will be resolved. This means that Brad's main strength in this matchup is to actually do what's happening now. Play true full neutral. Because at the end of Brad's neutral strings, there are options for avoiding Kokoro's counterattacks, as you've just seen. The closer range strings, the ones that you're used to your opponent messing up the hold or similar, tend to put Kokoro in advantage, but neutral moves? No, at that point, Kokoro has to quote-unquote guess. And because, again, Brad doesn't always end up at a range where throwing Brad is a thing, it's not as easy to get away with. Causing this whole thing to become an exercise in exactly what we mentioned before. You don't think so much here. You know what's supposed to be done for the most part, and you repeat various variations of it. Unfortunately, once again, this basically comes down to our Kokoro player needing to learn more Kokoro combos. Specifically hit confirming style ones of, oh, that's not the situation I expected, so now I have to go a different damage route. But those will come with time. It is in fact what made Indigo so effective with Bayman. The ability to take that same sort of situation and have so many more options that don't require you to actually know every little combo. Otherwise, they're relatively similar characters. They have enough reach to punish or at least force the opponent to defend after their offense from a lot of places, and have similar issues in neutral because their moves are either slow or don't reach, in Kokoro's case, after an opponent has positioned themselves particularly well. Dwarf doesn't tend to play characters that do a lot of instant reacting to things. It's either I know what you're going to do and therefore I'm going to counter it, or I have finished defending and my character has advantage at the end of this defensive string for whatever reason, or in some cases can force advantage in the middle of defensive strings through any number of means. In this case, I feel as if the problem is at least slightly that Kokoro just doesn't quite have the reach that this player is used to. But you can see even there, a lot of the normals are similar enough in specific ways between the two characters. That kick, for example. Now, while there are definitely quite a few characters in the game that have moves like this, after all, there are only so many ways a human body can move until you start adding in fantastical things like you see in animated games or Street Fighter. But even so, it's still relatively specific. That upward swinging hit is more so a Bayman than Kokoro, and I don't actually remember the last character that uses those. Similarly, the forward stomping, driving uppercut style attack. Other characters definitely have I'm swinging into an uppercut, but not from that range, not necessarily in that way. Shoulder checks, long range stomp punches. The main difference, which might be causing problems, but could be worked around with, again, more combo practice, is simply that. Not quite enough reach sometimes. Interestingly, one of the things that having less reach makes difficult is that one becomes more predictable. When you have a lot of reach on a character with multiple moves, your opponent can't be absolutely sure which one of those things is going to happen. We're not talking punishes here, we're talking I want to reposition, but my opponent might hit something out of the 4 things they can hit that can reach me from there. And they're all hard to hold, they're all different. Sometimes they even need to be blocked slightly differently. Maybe I should just defend. And that moment is enough to give them some advantage in terms of hitting, or resetting the situation to their preference. Kokoro lacks this above all else. She has very clear moves she can do to reach at almost every spacing, but she doesn't tend to have a very large set of them, and the startup on some of them is long enough that you might as well consider yourself to not have that reach. Like, your opponent could literally see it coming if they were even remotely primed for it and hold it in time, and they can easily be primed for it because she doesn't have a bunch of different options. Mostly, Kokoro manages to close that distance that Bayman closes in one move by using a string of more than one. But even the strings themselves are somewhat predictable sometimes because the variation wouldn't reach. This is particularly bad against Ayane because Ayane actually has not only good backdash, but specific intent to get away from you at specific times. she will set up attack strings where the win condition is either you're going to get hit by this move or I'm going to get away from you right afterward. But as mentioned before, once Kokoro does get close enough that she does have this level of confusing options, Ayane's job becomes a lot harder.
That was truly a beautiful dance. Thank you.
So if anything were to be a takeaway for these two players, Kokoro should work on hitting more often with strings, and Ayane basically don't miss. Our stream is drifting towards its end. Almost certainly only another 10 to 15 minutes to go. The lounge itself, I bet today it's going to stay open a while longer. Probably about half an hour, or at least somewhere in the realm of that. People do tend to leave for various reasons at the end of the stream part of the lounge, meaning that if you do join up now or soon, you're more likely to get a match or two quickly before the actual lounge closes. Generally, we don't expect it. This game has not exactly been winning any popularity contests lately, and new games coming out always get a lot of attention. People will spend long periods of time in training mode, and that is quite enjoyable if you know what you're doing.
Let's see how strong you are.
News on that front actually is that the Guilty Gear Strive beta has indicated to us that so far Guilty Gear's system for recorded actions and bots is exactly the same as it was in Xrd and therefore completely useless. The best you could do is find a turbo controller or some modifier that causes it to keep pressing the playback option so you can get more random stuff. I'm not even going to full details on that. The Guilty Gear fans will learn about it some other way, but if you're a Guilty Gear fan, you probably already know why the sort of thing we do on our Street Fighter bots, and to even some extent on the Dragon Ball FighterZ bots, will not work in Guilty Gear in any form. Even this game, which has a bot system that we really should complain to them about, specifically that your training inputs are erased between online matches. I can't imagine why this is this way. It's still possible to get more out of it generally than trying to do bots in Guilty Gear. So unfortunately we don't have much to offer there, and hopefully the game will have a nice strong tutorial. We have a lot of opinions about Guilty Gear Strive, and probably, again, aren't going to be sharing most of those. You'll know more when the game comes out, and you can hear all about them then. Especially if not much has changed, it'll be easy to clarify everything. In that sense though, we still have a bot upcoming. Street Fighter V has decided to go into Season 5, and that means we now have more bots that need to be made. Danbot is, in fact, probably complete. Unfortunately, understanding exactly how to make proper use of it is quite difficult, and the inputs, while they do work, have a bit more nuance in terms of timing than many other bots. most others you don't care whether or not the jump in is perfect or similar, for example, but on Danbot it looks like we're going to have to care. And for those of us who can't do those recordings perfectly, because they are quite hard, surprisingly, there will be some alternatives in the variants to help out with it. But if you would like to try to use it and you are familiar with our bots and the ways they're recorded or the systems or anything, you can tune in for Disc's guidance for Danbot tomorrow at our usual stream time. And if you want to get even ahead of that, we did in fact put the Proto Danbot on our Twitter _MK_FGC in a quick thread, giving both the inputs and some small explanations about them. In all arrogance, I completely outdid myself in that Danbot was technically almost done before, but there were enough changes, small components needed to be moved around. I had to swap the backdash and forward dash aspects of the input, among other things, like one action that had the backdash in it needed to have the forward dash in it, and so on. But because V-Shift was a relatively predictable mechanic in terms of which buttons needed to be pressed, I didn't need to do a bunch of redevelopment. Basically, Action 1 already contained the V-Shift, with one minor change required, specifically that you don't V-Shift while pressing any directions. So Street Fighter fans can look out for that, or go look for that. As we don't expect many changes to the prototype, just a bunch of tightened up explanations and variations that you can use depending on your character and your skill with the inputs. Again, they're quite difficult. It involves holding lots of buttons, different timings, and so on. Generally with the whole, that you'll end up with a Danbot that really shows off some of what Dan is famous for. We feel as if we've gotten a good representation of that this time around. And so far, I haven't seen a whole lot of indications of strategies for the character that will require us to do something else. As usual, there was some work done to make sure that you could get one set of things from fighting the CPU version and a different set of skills from fighting our bot. But there is some more overlap than usual, simply because the way Dan fights is generally not very adaptable. He's more so depending on something else from the opponent's side. But definitely tune in tomorrow for that. Of course, it will still be placed on our YouTube channel for you to reference at any time, as are streams like this one.
This is the melody.
On Sunday, the specific bot page will be released at 2-mk.org. And you can find Danbot under Dan-bot. All bots themselves can be found under just bots, because Street Fighter was the original game we did these for, or SF5, SFV-bots, and similarly for other games that have them, which of course does not include Guilty Gear. We still have no intention of putting much effort into bot development for this game. We will definitely do it by request, but given everything going on about it, everything going on in the FGC as a whole for people focused on other games, and again, the terrible flaw that you can't use them between matches anyway, it's not currently worth a lot of time. The 4 that exist are useful for learning a lot of beginner things and practicing a bunch of stuff that can be difficult to practice against a CPU or player opponent.
All right.
So I definitely still recommend
Let us begin. begin the experiment.
using those, especially if you just want to get your feet wet or poke around. Because this is another of those games where it doesn't matter too much how well it goes in. A lot of what you need to learn isn't about reaction time, but understanding what to do. And that can help a lot. As mentioned, it looks like our lounge is closing up a little bit. You'll see less people. And that means if you want to jump in and get matches against those who remain, now's the time. I could even give you my top Nico strats. My top Nico strats consist of pressing one key and then throwing. I'm not being particularly facetious about this though, it's really effective. Mainly because you don't care if your opponent tests to throw or not. This stage is a bad matchup. Nico benefits quite a lot from being knocked back enough to get certain advantages after her offense has failed. So I always get stressed in stages like this one where I say, oh, I got hit but I didn't end up that far away, this is terrible. And with that, I believe we've actually come to the end of our stream. Another hypothesis verified. This has been Brilliant 14 2MK. Join us tomorrow for Danbot. Good luck with your training and good night, everyone.